Hello, Internet. My name is Chamomile.
And I, Mother Sorrow, do take you to be my lawfully wedded husband.
I should have guessed that there was no law against shotgun weddings in Arkansas.
I do.
So, do my responses here matter at all, or...
They do not.
That was my guess. Still not sure what you get out of this.
It's all, it's all part of my cunning plan.
See, I figured that you probably had a cunning plan up until you claimed to have one. Now I'm not so sure.
You just don't worry your pretty little head about it, Mr. Sorrow.
I mean, I do usually tend to get distracted by other things within, like, 5 minutes of being unable to solve a problem, so...
That is fair.
So, you've switched to the Requiem voice, but, like, in this specific context, that actually doesn't make me super comfortable.
So let's talk about Game of Thrones.
Sure, I guess we're doing that now. So
They realize that that's old. This is old hat by the now that we're talking about it. And as usual, Lindsay Ellis already did a much better video than anything we're gonna do. But
not only that, but like it was old hat by the time she did it. Like, you know, she missed the controversy by like 3 months, and then we're going like a year after that.
But we have opinions.
We do. So, I don't think you have ever talked on air about Cersei.
Yeah, every single aspect of Cersei's arc was like a disaster. So like she blew up the Vatican.
Pardon?
And faced no consequences for it. Like the Faith of the Seven is not as important as the Catholic Church was in Westeros, but like it's still pretty important. And Cersei doesn't really have a power base to speak of. She doesn't have any claim to legitimacy. Like, how does she even get the throne? She doesn't. Women can't inherit the throne, first of all. Second of all, even like if they could, like she's not a Targaryen or a Baratheon. She doesn't have a familial claim to the throne. She's not ruling as a she's not the Dowager Queen or anything anymore. She's killed off all of her children who have claims to the throne. Well, she didn't kill them off, but like they've all died. So she can't do like Empress Dowager Cece and effectively be the ruler. She can't do like Wu Jitian. She hasn't like maneuvered herself into a position where it would make sense for her to become a queen on her own merit.
Yeah.
And
she has...
like there's nothing, like she's blown up a major part of the power structure of Westeros. It's like, why wouldn't just everyone just turn on her immediately? Like the center of the Faith of the Seven has been destroyed. People are going to take that either as a sign of the gods' displeasure, or they're going to see it as something that somebody has done that's going to immediately cause the gods to have displeasure. I think the first people they're going to blame in either circumstance is going to be the rulers, so they're going to storm the Red Keep and kill whoever's in it, which is going to be Cersei. So it's like, yeah, she killed all her enemies, and she just made 1,000 more.
Yeah, I mean, there are no longer any named characters, you know, left to get in Cersei's way, but, like, those people still all have their armies lying around. Like,
and they all have big extended families, like... They all got their cadet branches and whatever, like in all their loyal houses, like, and just because we know that like three named members of this house have died, that hasn't actually destroyed the whole house. Houses are big, they're extended families.
Yeah, and Cersei was just barely publicly humiliated by her enemies, like, which, like, that doesn't meaningfully decrease her power, but it does make it very obvious that she had absolutely no power. There was no one to fight for her. She has no army to uphold her claim. So, like, you can fabricate a claim just out of the pure, well, I got a bunch of guys with swords, and what are you going to do about it? But also, Cersei clearly is unable to do that. She does not have a bunch of guys with swords. But yeah, you cannot take and hold power simply by killing your enemies. Like, that is the kind of thing that Cersei would think would work, but which doesn't actually work. Except the showrunners apparently don't know that. They apparently do think that, taking power is just a matter of being a battle royale between named characters, and whoever the last named character alive is, they get the throne. And all the unnamed characters just fall in line because they have no motivations unto themselves.
Like, Cersei was always, like, pretty impulsive about not understanding the consequences of her actions. Like, when she was in conflict with Marjorie, Marjorie would always outmaneuver her, and because Marjorie understood, like, blowback. Marjorie would never did anything that would have caused blowback, but Cersei, meanwhile, is willing to flip over the table in order to win, and she's constantly having blowback because of that. Like, when she empowers the Faith Militia as a way to strike against Marjorie, and then it blows back in her face. So it makes sense that Cersei might do something like this as a last resort, but it should have had a blowback. Like, you can't kill a bunch of nobles and the head of the major faith in your kingdom, even though the faith of the Seven seems significantly less powerful than the Catholic Church. They're still pretty important. You should be able to do that and face no consequences. Every single noble house in Westeros should now want her blood, even if they didn't have relatives in the Red Keep, just because, like, it's shown that she's absolutely untrustworthy, and she will kill a ton of people. Like, she should have lost all loyalty.
Yeah,
especially as a feudal lord. She's not trustworthy as a feudal lord.
Yeah. No one has any reason to trust her. There is no tradition upholding her claim. No one particularly has, a purely pragmatic reason to support her, right? She is not dangerous. She has no army. She is dangerous only to the extent that she is allowed to stay on the throne, despite the fact that there are no guards keeping her there. So
it would honestly, it's like it really should have ended up like the Glorious Revolution, with every noble in Westeros throwing behind the foreign invader with an army. Like, Daenerys is basically William of Orange at this point. She's going to get handed the throne.
Probably. She at least has a claim to it. And, definitely the obvious result. And Game of Thrones is all about this political stuff, right? So you've got to get it right. And the obvious result of blowing up the Sept is that, yeah, all of Cersei's enemies are killed, but then in the immediate aftermath, either, the new set of enemies or just the peasantry storm the Red Keep, kill at least her, probably a bunch of other people, and then all of the nobles and hedge knights and stuff who are still left lying around have to figure out what to do next. Throwing in behind Daenerys, who has a claim to the throne, would make sense. They could also just end up bickering amongst themselves, trying to put one of themselves on the throne. Although if they had that kind of ambition, you would have expected a lot of them to have, started pursuing it earlier. So presumably a lot of these guys are just trying to protect the status and position they have.
It's part of why I think ultimately just everybody's going to end up throwing in that scenario. Had it played out in a meaningful way, everyone would have immediately thrown in behind Daenerys. Like, she gets the red carpet thrown out for her at that point.
Yeah. That is...
Especially since she's like the last legitimate claimant at that point. Like, Jon's claim hasn't been established.
So yeah, if you wanted to force that plot, in a different direction, just because that does just kind of wrap things up in a surprisingly neat little bow. It's like, okay, well, Westeros is now united. Let's go deal with the others. I think they're called, whatever the snow zombies.
The White Walkers.
The White Walkers. That's the one. Like, at that point, it's just a big old slugfest between the remaining forces of Westeros, everyone who isn't dead, and the snow zombies, which that would admittedly not be a very good ending, right? You would want to find some monkey wrench to throw into that. That Daenerys just shows up and is immediately appointed queen. But that is, the obvious expected result. Should have seen that coming. The spike bit was there for a reason. But yeah, that is the obvious result. What you would expect to happen from Cersei's actual actions. Like, she does not have any more allies or resources to burn through being an idiot like that. Like, clearly, the show went out of its way, in a very HBO way, to demonstrate that she is basically powerless.
Like if you want her to remain a threat, like, she needs to... Sorry.
We need to demonstrate that Cersei is, hated not only by the people, but has also completely lost political influence. How can we do that? By getting her naked.
Like, if you want her, like, I get that if you want her to remain a threat and to ultimately beat the Knights Militia, the Faith Militia, and Marjorie, but then you're gonna have to think of another way to do it, because the way you did it in the story, she should ultimately have lost very badly.
I mean,
I don't have an idea like what she should have done off the top of my head.
Like, it makes sense that the Faith Militia would have been totally crippled by the blow, but Cersei would also have been killed in the immediate aftermath by the blowback. So
yeah, it's like you got to think of another way if you want her to remain a threat and also win, like, because that is not that should not have been a victory path for her.
Nope, I cannot jump over that.
Continuing with Game of Thrones, another character whose plot did not work, though for entirely different reasons, is Arya, who, very early on is established as kind of like an adventurer type. Sort of adventurous kid type. And at the end, she's an adventurous kid type with super assassin powers. She's not changed or grown or lost anything from having joined the Faceless Men. She just got superpowers from it.
And the whole arc of her training with the Faceless Men was just confused and dumb. Like, it just kind of seems like they didn't know what to have her do, so they just had her do some random shit for a while, and
she should have... What should have happened is she should have gone through with the training and completed the training and become an assassin and lost her identity, essentially. And maybe at some point she goes back to Westeros and regains it after an encounter with a family member, but she shouldn't just get a bunch of assassin superpowers. Like, she should have become a Faceless Man.
Right.
For real, not just somebody who has the Faceless Man powers. She should have lost something in that process. The girl Arya should have been dead. Also, in the confrontation with Sansa, like, they do something that I consider cheating, because they're trying to make the big twist that Sansa and Arya weren't actually against each other be the very end when they confront Littlefinger. But then Arya and Sansa have a confrontation before that, when Sansa discovers the Oh, that was a close one.
Yeah, it all worked out though.
When Sansa discovers the faces, that confrontation only makes sense if it only exists specifically to dupe the audience into thinking that Arya has like killed Sansa. It doesn't make sense if they are actually in on it together the whole time. Bran told them what was going on. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It only exists. That scene only existed to dupe the audience. That's cheating. That's a bad setup.
Yeah.
Like, they kind of did that in Westworld, which Westworld is basically the science fiction version of Game of Thrones. They have a cheating scene like that. There might be a justification for it, but it still kind of annoyed me. But like, you shouldn't cheat like that for a twist.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the same vein of, that my funny because it's true joke about the season 8 ending is that, yeah, we subverted your expectations that it would be good by making it suck. And that is like sort of in the same vein where it's like, oh yeah, we gave you, you never guessed what was really going to happen, because what was really going to happen made absolutely no sense given the evidence that we gave you.
Which also, Arya being the one to kill the Night's King was dumb. It was not set up at all. It's all part of the whole cult of the badass thing. We're like, oh, it's so badass that she just killed the Night's King. Well, it's like, it's not what you set up. It should have been Dany or Jon. One of those two.
Well, it's also, that one feels like another subverting expectations thing, where it's like, I mean, who is going to kill the Night King that's not a twist. All right, it is not a twist to have Arya be the one to do that.
And also, Bran ended up having no role in that whatsoever, despite being built up. So it should have something to do with Jon, Bran, or Dany. But it's Arya, because she's just so badass. And it's like, here's kind of what I thought maybe should have happened that would have been a little bit better. Jon kills the Night's King. He's the prince who was promised. The Red Priests actually immediately declare him the prince who was promised. They forget about their deal with Daenerys. There's even maybe like, since we know that the North will occasionally do ascension via proclamation, the North tries to immediately proclaim him the king of the North. Though the Night's King should have gotten much further south than Winterfell. It was bullshit that he barely even penetrated the North, but we'll put that aside for the moment. Jon gets, like, he doesn't want it, but like, there's a real movement among the people and the nobility to make him the king. This infuriates Dany, because she wanted to be the conquering hero and also be queen. Dany kills Jon, and then Arya kills Dany.
Yeah, that would have worked. That would have been a means of going mad that would have fit Dany much better than just randomly killing civilians for no reason.
Yeah, the thing with Dany's arc is there was always the issue that Dany was kind of two themes that were eventually not compatible, going to be not compatible with each other. On the one hand, she's this sort of feminist girl power figure, but on the other hand, she's also a critique of American interventionism. And eventually, one of those was going to have to give way. And it ended up being the feminist theme that gave way to the critique of American interventionism, because which I was always kind of what I saw coming, but like, it wasn't set up properly that was where they were going to fall on. Like, it's not until the last minute that they remember that this was even supposed to be a thing. And like, honestly, like, they kind of like, because she ends up like, she had all those issues in Marine, very like similar to like the United States issues with nation building in Iraq. But she eventually just solves it, like, with her dragon. Like, she just fixes everything with a snap of her fingers, which I don't think is necessarily going to happen in the books, but happened in the TV show, and kind of, like, hurt the theme of sort of this criticism of American adventurism in the Middle East. And
I mean, that gets into the cult of the badass thing again, where it's like, oh, what is the solution to this moral quagmire? Answer, fucking dragons.
The whole thing with Danny and Marine in Slaver's Bay is like she had no idea how this culture functioned and how to rule effectively. Like she was not capable of nation building in Marine, which sort of raises questions about her ability to nation build in Westeros, where she is just as foreign. But then it's like, oh yeah, we forgot about that. Because like George R. R. Martin was a very early critic of the Iraq War, and I think that feeds into Daenerys' arc. I think like she is partially a critique of the white savior trope. She's this sort of white hero figure in this very Middle Eastern coded kingdom, but also she does a very poor job at ruling, and because I think she is a deconstruction of the white savior trope. But the moment, the further away the showrunners got from having George R. R. Martin be able to hold their hand, the worse the show got. They needed George R. R. Martin holding their hand. And once they didn't have that, they didn't know what to do, and they sort of retreated to these generic fantasy tropes. And it made the show worse.
Yeah, generic fantasy tropes, which the show had, until that point, been, like, setting up a takedown for, and then suddenly they just kind of fell back into playing them straight.
Yeah.
Except when occasionally, where, they would do the thing where they subvert some, like, ludicrous detail of them, because they got the idea that the show was supposed to be subverting tropes. So they would do that by having Arya kill the Winter King or the Night King, instead of Jon, which, like, that's not actually a significant subversion of the story. Like, those characters don't represent extremely different things at all. Like, one of them was just set up and the other one wasn't.
Like, I was glad that neither Dany nor Jon ended up ruling the Seven Kingdoms, because I think part of what the series was getting at under Martin is that a good king is still a king and kings are bad. Like, the justification for everybody who is seeking the throne basically is the same. This pre-ideological society. The Daenerys' ultimate justification for ruling Westeros is not "I would be a better ruler." It is that it's mine by fire and blood, by birthright and war, and that's the justification. That would have been the justification for Jon. That's essentially the justification for Cersei. Everyone has the same justification for rulership, and Daenerys being a good ruler, like, sure, she might have been a good ruler, but, like, she's a good ruler as a hobby. Like, that's not what justifies her rule. What justifies her rule is I'm a Targaryen. And the thing is, like, if she goes mad, or if her kids are bad rulers, there's no checks or balances on the monarchy that will remove her or her children from rule.
Yeah, precedent and tradition have a significant influence on all human affairs, and Dany is not setting up a precedent or tradition of good rulership. She just, as a hobby, has personally decided that she is going to indulge in that.
Yeah. She doesn't claim her power derives from the people or from being a good ruler. Her power ultimately claims from blood right and conquest, the same as anybody else. This is ultimately I think part of the point is, like, kings are bad. Like, yeah, that was part of the point.
She talks about breaking the wheel, but she absolutely does not give up an inch of her own power in doing so. She's perfectly happy to help the common people by making enemies of existing powers, but at no point in, breaking the wheel does she ever even consider giving up any of her own power as queen.
Which makes sense for the world that Game of Thrones exists in. And
like, you would not expect even a perfectly well-intentioned, non-mad person to necessarily... Oh, that's right, I gotta go through this door. To necessarily be able to figure that out, just ex nihilo. It feels obvious to us now because we already have a lot of functioning democratic governments in the world and in history. But, it would be perfectly reasonable if Dany was simply not able to work out that 300 years of democracy, of modern democracy that we have in the real world from nothing.
Yeah. Like, I hated at the end when the one guy suggested letting everybody vote, because he doesn't exist in a world where that would make sense to anybody. Like, nobody would come up with the idea of letting the common people vote. The next step in, like, moving from monarchy to democracy would not be, we'll just let all the common people vote. The next step is, like, there's, like, some sort of council of nobles that gets to have a check on the power of the king. Like, Westeros is not even at the point where the bourgeoisie can ask for that much power. Like, the nobles can ask for some sort of, like, parliament, but not even the bourgeoisie really is at the point where it has enough influence to ask for anything. Like, this is a feudal society. Like, and what I thought should have happened again at the end is, rather than, kingdoms now and we're an elective monarchy, which was stupid, is what should have happened. Like, the theme of the show was, like, the fight for the Iron Throne was a sideshow that cost a lot more than it was worth. So what should have happened was, after Drogon destroys the Iron Throne, is like, all right, the Iron Throne is gone. We're dissolving the Seven Kingdoms. We're all independent now. I'm like, they let the North be independent, but Dorne and Iron Islands pretty clearly do not want to be part of the Seven Kingdoms either at this point. And I think at the point that you're down to 4, you might as well just be down to 0. Like, just dissolve the Kingdom of Westeros into its constituent parts.
I don't think the Iron Islands count as one of the 7.
Hold on, let me use my oracular or hag powers.
Like, yeah, I think the Iron Islands don't actually count as one of the 7, but I'm not positive, so...
I'm communing with the Great Crone Mother. The north, the mountain and the vale, the isles and rivers. No, the Kingdom of Isles and Rivers was the title held by the Ironborn ruler of the Iron Islands and the Riverlands.
Okay, so they are one of the 7.
Yes. But, like, basically nobody really a lot of people don't want to be part of the Seven Kingdoms anymore, and it's clear from the show that, like, the Seven Kingdoms' existence was not worth it.
Right.
It was a sideshow to what should have been the real problem, which was the Night King, who also should have, like, been the main threat for, like, 3 seasons. Like, he should have been, like, he had, like, 2 episodes at the end.
I don't know if he needed 3 seasons, but he definitely should have been the main threat of the final season. Like, I think there could have been a season where he is overrunning the North, but everyone in the South is still too busy squabbling to do anything about it. And then a season after that, where the imminence of the Night King's threat as he gets past the neck and is now running amok in Westeros finally sets aside whatever remaining feuds there are. Maybe Cersei has to be outright killed at this point. I don't know. We're into deep alternative plotting here, but yeah, the final season should have focused on the Night King. I think the season before that, it should have been obvious that the Night King should have been the focus, but people were still reluctant to give up their petty feuds, and so that would have been the focus of that season.
One of the plot lines that the showrunners completely seem to have forgotten about, that is a big thing at first and then just kind of drops off, is this idea of magic coming back. And I don't know what you would do with that. I don't know what Martin was planning on doing with that, but it's one of those plot lines that was clearly very important. Like, the Warlocks in Quarth have this whole thing about their magic is working again now that Dany and her dragons have shown up. And the dragons are back. Like, it's supposed to have a whole thing of magic coming back, but they never end up going anywhere with it in the show.
So George R. R. Martin established the terms of gardener versus architect for the And I don't think he is the first one to talk about this dichotomy in general, but I do believe he is the origin of that specific phraseology for it, which is that the idea of, some writers plan everything out in advance, other writers just start writing, and then do a whole lot more editing to make everything consistent with each other once they've, written enough of the book to know where it's going. I believe Martin has said that he is a gardener, which means he may not have actually had a plan for where the Return of Magic was going. Although, if he's any good at gardening, he would have figured out something to do with it, and he would certainly have at least had an inkling. He would have had a general idea, if not a specific plan. With that said, I have absolutely no confidence that Martin is going to write even one more book in the series, let alone two.
Yeah.
He's missed too many of his own self-imposed deadlines. Is this the last one? This is the last one. So unless this one takes me like 15-20 minutes, we should be, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? Okay, here we are. Those golem guys are invincible. I can't actually defeat them.
And here's something I think we can all agree on. The show needed more full frontal male nudity. Like, I joke, but I'm only, like, half joking. Like, it really annoyed me with the South Park episode. Like, there's not that much male nudity. And, like, in, like, the 6th or 7th season, like, they kind of responded to it. There's this part where, like, there's a normal scene, and then they cut to a guy's dick, and he's, like, examining it for genital warts. And, like, it's so, like, disassociated that it, like, when you see it, it doesn't even register what it is. Like, it felt like D&D being mad that anyone said that, like, they should have equal opportunity nudity in the show.
I mean, I feel like a lot of the show's nudity was basically just shock, it was a combination of shock and pretension, basically. Like, an effort to have a fig leaf justification of artistic merit on top of something whose actual goal was to provoke outrage from people who were not in their demographic anyway, so that they could, appear to be censored artists, standing up to the bullies. That is, that and a combination of that and just base sex appeal, which is a thing you can have in your show, like, that's fine, but Game of Thrones was, claiming to be something else with its nudity. It was claiming to have a sense of, like, reality to it, and that is just very obviously not the case. The sex scenes, the nude scenes in Game of Thrones, the way they are framed, the purpose they serve in the story, they are almost all and almost entirely for the purpose of just titillation. Like, I am down with the idea of an erotic fantasy where, eroticism and fantasy are both executed well on, because normally, if something is erotic, then that's the only thing it can be good at, because that niche is, so frowned upon in the first place, that, like, no one just casually decides to mix the erotic niche with another genre, the way that, a sci-fi fantasy or whatever is just another thing. Which means that erotica is almost never good at anything but at being anything except erotica. Whatever other genre conventions it has are there to serve additional titillation and nothing else. And that kind of disappoints me. I would not mind migrating away from that, but Game of Thrones did not claim to be that, did not aspire to that. It claimed to be making, an artistic statement about the Middle Ages as they really were, and that's
so let's talk about that. Like, how historically accurate is Game of Thrones?
I believe we have talked about this before, actually, although it may have been in the Pathfinder episodes. And
I think you've mentioned it, but we've not gone super in depth.
Right. So it's certainly what Game of Thrones. The reason why Game of Thrones comes across as so realistic is because it got one specific thing that was very important to the Middle Ages. It got it very right, in a way that is almost always whitewashed, and so that is where this reputation of, Game of Thrones as the Middle Ages as they really were, largely comes from, which is feudalism. The Westerosi feudal system is not especially similar to any real-world feudal system. However, it is a plausible real-world feudal system, right? If someone tells me that, well, actually, this one Eastern European, or like this one duchy of the Holy Roman Empire, one of their 176 or whatever it is, individual polities who were stapled together into one empire, function pretty much exactly the way that Westerosi feudalism does, then that wouldn't surprise me. So, Westerosi feudalism is a little bit simplified, which is fine, because real feudalism was an overcomplicated mess to the point where it is basically unreasonable to expect any real human being to keep track of it and be able to write a book about it. And so that fundamental feudal contract, right, of vassals owe loyalty to their lords and lords owe protection to their vassals, and there is no ideology backing it up. Right? The closest you get to an ideology is the blessing of God.
Which is downplayed in Game of Thrones, relatively.
It is.
Westeros is a lot more religiously tolerant than medieval Europe ever was. Also, the Faith of the Seven, the relationship to the government seems a lot closer to the relationship of England to the Anglican Church or the Byzantine Empire to the Orthodox Church, where it's a theocracy, but it's a theocracy in reverse. The church exists to support the state rather than vice versa. And the Faith of the Seven doesn't really seem to be a parallel institution the way the Catholic Church was.
Which is one of many ways that feudalism, Western European feudalism in particular, which Game of Thrones otherwise is aping pretty hard, that is another way in which that is oversimplified, is that you don't have these parallel hierarchies. Everyone ultimately answers to the king.
Yeah, and the bourgeoisie is not as important as it will get, like, into the modern era, but, like, it was still a thing. Like, you should have some interaction with the bourgeoisie, what will become the bourgeoisie, at least, the traders and the independent towns.
Yeah, and the like they say, the Dark Ages, right? The Game of Thrones takes place somewhere between the high to late feudal medieval era. So, yeah, you would expect, like, the bourgeoisie has some developing power at that point. Trade guilds are getting more powerful. Merchants and so forth are more, it is a lot more plausible to go to the far ends of the continent, come back with cool stuff, and be alive at the end of it. So, yeah, Game of Thrones is a heavily oversimplified version of feudalism, but it does get that feudalism is not a nation-state, right? There is no central government. There is just a series of agreements between individual nobles, rising in a roughly pyramid shape. Like, the easiest way to explain this is that the central government does not have any right to adjust the boundaries of its constituent provinces. which is really bizarre for even in America, where, you know, the sovereignty of states is a, you know, whole thing. It's nevertheless, states can rewrite the boundaries of their counties, right? Like, that's not even a big deal. So, you know, America has this thing where it is originally and nominally still like a federated coalition of 50 sovereign nations, but those individual states are states. And the medieval system does not have states like that. Like, period, at any level. You know, a county is the personal property of a count. And he has agreed to basically, you know, he has agreed to fight in the service of a duke or whatever in exchange for the duke protecting him from outside invasion. But
feudalism is weirdly similar to a homeowners association.
Yeah. You know, if your furniture were sapient. It's like, no, of course you can't just move to the house next door, couch. And it is the hardest boss in the entire game.
She's kicking your ass.
And she is much more difficult than either of the two forms of the Pope. Like, she deals a ton of damage. She is, you know, approximately the same size as the Penitent one. And, you know, so she bounces around all over the place. She isn't a stationary guy that you can jump around and wait for opportunities to strike the way you can with some of the bigger bosses. Ultimately, I just find it much easier to fight a big old beastie than someone who is about my size and speed. I do like, though, that she has a fairly similar move set to us. Like, you know, her making a boss who actually fights with the same moves as the player character is very difficult, and that's not what's going on here. But, like, you know, she has a parry move that she uses. A lot of her area attacks look pretty similar to some of our spells.
One point that a collection of unmitigated pedantry made, which is a blog that Cam and Requiem were reading at the same time and describing to each other because they're the same person. One point that blog made was that as set up in the show, with the North being independent and Sansa being on the throne versus Bran Stark being the elected monarch of the Six Kingdoms, what's going to happen is the Six Kingdoms is going to be devoured piece by the North.
I mean, you say piece by piece, but like, I can't remember what his justification for that was, but I kind of feel like that's going to happen, like, instantly, actually. Like, Bran is going to die. He's unlikely to have an heir.
Well, the piece by piece is Sansa is starting out with a claim on the Riverlands because since the throne of the North went to her instead of Bran, there's now a justification that for inheritance via a female, which means as the eldest child of Catelyn, who is the eldest child of the ruler of the Riverlands, she can claim that she's the legitimate ruler of the Riverlands, so she has a claim on the Riverlands. And then from there, like, the North can constantly interfere in the elections of the Six Kingdoms and always have a Stark on the throne and eventually just devour it piece by piece from there. And the North is basically is kind of ahistorically basically a nation state at that point. There's a northern identity in a way that doesn't seem to exist anywhere else.
You have to ride back the elevator up every time. Like, there's not a meaningful distance between the last checkpoint. Like, you know, there's no challenge between the last checkpoint and here. But there is just a bit of distance that you have to walk.
Yeah.
She keeps doing the parry thing. I don't know what her plan is.
I mean, she's been pretty successful fighting you so far.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the parry attack is one of the ones I can most consistently block.
I wonder if she would be interested in co-hosting a podcast.
Chrysanta really doesn't want to lose this fight.
Oh my god.
Her blitzes have gotten a lot longer. And less predictable. But not enough to save her.
Oh my god.
Yeah, you say Requiem Aeternam, but she's going to be back in about an hour.
Purge my soul, bitten by the miracle.
I'll do my best. Please die. You bastard. Yeah. So, yep, that was Chrysanta. Whether you try to kill her or not, she survives. And not to give away any spoilers or anything, but she ruins everything.